I'm not just fighting for me, I'm fighting for you. I'm fighting for the values of the state. And there's a lot at stake because in these elections, who knows what can happen? And so I'm going to fight it.
That's California Governor Gavin Newsom talking about the recall effort that appears to have enough support to move forward. The folks who want him out seem to have met the Wednesday deadline to turn in 1.5 million signatures to move his recall to the ballot and may have even exceeded that total. So now we're waiting for the state's election officials to weigh in. Some voters are angry about his handling of the COVID shutdowns and also how he flouted some rules that he had asked residents to follow. Joining us to discuss, Jeremy White. Jeremy is a reporter for Politico covering California politics. He's also the co-writer of their California playbook. Jeremy, let's begin with the process. There was a signature collection process. It cleared the needed threshold, though it's worth noting that process was given additional time because of COVID. So how does it work from here? When is the recall? Who's on the ballot? Is it just yes or no on Governor Newsom, or will other candidates appear?
I should say that it has not officially cleared the threshold yet. It looks likely that it will, given that proponents say they've submitted well in excess of 2 million signatures when they need about 1.5 million. We're not going to know for certain if election officials certify this election for a few weeks, but it certainly looks likely. Even Governor Newsom is acknowledging at this point that it's likely happening and is fully engaged in a campaign. So we are likely to see an election sometime in the fall, likely October or November. The candidate filing deadline will be shortly before that. So the field is still very much taking shape. We have 3 Republicans who have officially declared, and I think people expect scores more, potentially in excess of 100 candidates to get in there by the time all is said and done. And then logistically, California voters are asked 2 questions. The first question is, should we recall Gavin Newsom? And if a majority say no, we'll keep him. That's it. He survived. If a majority want to replace him, then we go to the second question of who should be his replacement. And that's where it could get very chaotic, given, as I've said, we are likely to see many, many candidates on that second ballot.
What are the issues that led to Newsom's likely recall? We saw those photos of him eating at an exclusive Napa Valley restaurant while the state was in COVID restriction mode. That's sort of the ready-made ad against him. But is that what's really driving this recall, or is something else happening?
I think what that French Laundry dinner did was really crystallize the frustration out there with pandemic restrictions and Californians feeling like they have been uneven. I would say another really major thing I think has driven this has been the number of students who have still not returned to in-classroom learning. And I think it's important to remember that the pandemic hasn't just driven voter frustration with Gavin Newsom that got us here. It also led the courts to give signature gatherers an extension in how much time they had to qualify this because of the way the pandemic made it more difficult to be out there on the streets. So I think in multiple ways, without the pandemic, we are not here in this place today.
Last time California did this to then Governor Pete Wilson, there was a Republican challenger ready and waiting with a 100% Q rating named Arnold Schwarzenegger. So it was as much a new election as it was a recall. That doesn't feel like the case this go around, is it? And who are the leading Republicans that are being bandied about? Are they anywhere close to well-known enough as gubernatorial candidates?
I don't think any candidate yet in there or who has yet expressed an interest in running has the irreducible factor that Arnold Schwarzenegger had, which was celebrity, name recognition, people who might be excited to go to one of his political rallies. So there are a few Republican candidates in there now, former Congressman Doug Osee, former San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer, businessman John Cox, who was the Republican candidate in the 2018 gubernatorial election. I think it's fair to say the Republican establishment, elected officials and such, have coalesced behind Kevin Faulconer. He's seen as a more centrist figure, somebody who's won in a big, diverse city, and therefore could potentially replicate that kind of success statewide. But I think everyone is waiting to see if an Arnold Schwarzenegger type candidate gets in there, which is really to say a celebrity, somebody who people know who they are and would get excited by them as opposed to a political figure.
You mentioned COVID and schools as being drivers of this recall effort. There are also some serious questions about state governance, even the state's long-term sustainability. And some of those questions are coming from Democrats and progressives, noting things like population drain, overregulation, poverty, and the application of progressive policies. How much of that is a part of this recall drive, or is this really more red versus blue? Is there a sense that Newsom, he's certainly trying to paint himself as a scalp that can be had, trying to play into the partisanship of it? Is that resonating with voters?
That remains to be seen, of course, but there's no doubt that Governor Newsom and his team are framing this as sort of California's progressive values against Trump-aligned Republicans who are coming in and trying to unravel California's progress. So, look, make no mistake, even before the pandemic, California was facing serious issues, including a homelessness crisis, wildfires, and those were things that were very real problems that Gavin Newsom had to deal with, hadn't made much appreciable progress since the pandemic hit. I don't think that those things in isolation would have been enough to fuel the type of backlash we're seeing now. I really think that the pandemic and frustration with those restrictions has gotten us to where we are. That being said, opponents of the governor also have plenty to criticize in terms of the homelessness crisis and him being perceived as too liberal and those types of critiques. I just think that the pandemic is still very much the critical thing driving this.
Finally, Jeremy, I'm asking you these questions from a studio in New York State, where, as you may have heard, we're having some gubernatorial issues of our own. But a lot of people here would still scoff at the notion of a recall movement in general. Is there any blowback popping up in California about the notion of recalls themselves?
I think Californians are pretty accustomed to direct democracy at this point. There are some pretty valid critiques. With this, people think that it's a pretty low bar to get one on the ballot. They fear it could sort of allow for political opportunism. With ballot initiatives, there's a long-standing critique that they have sort of become a tool of special interests rather than of the citizenry. But look, this is baked into California's political culture. It's in the Constitution. So while there are those who maybe feel the system is being abused, I don't know that I would expect to see any sort of sustained public backlash that would change that structure.
Jeremy White is a reporter who covers California politics for Politico. He's also the co-writer of their California Playbook. Jeremy, really appreciate the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
During that interview, I said that Pete Wilson had been the last recalled California governor. It was Gray Davis. A little Friday error on my part. My apologies. Up next, we're going to show you part of what President Biden had to say after meeting with Asian American leaders in Atlanta earlier.